talking to us about psychedelics as a spiritual practice. So, kind of a new perspective, different from the past two talks that we've been listening to. What is spirituality? How does one define spirituality? Which is the question that Philip will be tackling today. Philip is an integration coach and founder of Psychedelic Actualization, which I'm sure he'll talk more about. And yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome Philip for our last morning talk.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Fine?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to be talking here. I'm very excited to be talking about psychedelics as a spiritual practice. So, a little bit about me. My name is Philip Hauenhorst, and around 9 years ago I have discovered psychedelics and spirituality at the same time. And since that day I basically dedicated my life to the synthesis of these two areas. And I've been sharing my insights online, and I've kind of like gathered a little community of about 9,000 people. And for the past 2 years I've been working as a psychedelic integration coach. So, for this inquiry we're going to be defining spirituality, looking at three possible ways psychedelics could be seen as a spiritual practice, and then we're going to look at pitfalls and integration. So the first question that's coming up in this, to lay some foundations, is what is spirituality? I want to give this question to you, like, what is spirituality? What do you think? What does spirituality mean to you? Feel free to throw in some stuff.
The conscious cultivation of clarity, love, wisdom. Using various spiritual practices.
Beautiful. A couple more?
So, I mean, obviously spirituality is very personal. For me, it's just finding a sense of interconnectedness in this world and getting, finding a place and not feeling completely isolated and separate from being.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Maybe one more? Okay, good enough. But we're going to be acknowledging that defining spirituality is very difficult. Like, there is no widely agreed upon definition. I'm going to make a bold statement. In my coach training program, they used to say, spirituality is not limited in any way or to anything. Well, it doesn't really say anything, right? But for this presentation, we're going to be looking at a few kind of like specific angles in which we could define spirituality, which are going to be supporting kind of like the content of my talk. And what I like to do when I like inquire into a word, because first and foremost spirituality is a word, I like to look at the etymology, so the quality or state of being concerned with the spirit. Spirit basically meaning breath or life force, so everything connected to life. And the next step I like to take is look at the dictionaries. Do not resonate with those two. This is what I don't mean by spirituality. Like, the dogs spoke one best, but it doesn't also really say anything. Dictionaries are very kind of like a tricky beast in finding words against words with themselves. And what I also do not mean with spirituality here is kind of like some dogma or belief, following rules or ideology, wishful thinking or feel-good fantasies, or rejection of science. Actually, I think it's not separate from science, but rather kind of like a different exploration of the nature of reality itself. So, we're going to be, I've cherry-picked like 3-4 definitions, which we're going to go into now. And one I would like to propose is spirituality as psychological deconditioning and deconstruction. The sage Psychedelic said the main purpose of true spirituality is to liberate oneself completely from one's concepts and conditioning. So basically spirituality is the direct, unfiltered experience of reality, free from conditioning, beliefs, and ego identification. And a subcategory of that, I would say, is spirituality is direct insight and understanding into the nature of reality. Lots of traditions have been big on insight and understanding as well. The second one I would like to propose is spirituality as mystical union and transcendence. So basically the recognition of unity with existence, seeing all separateness as illusion and awakening to the truth of absolute oneness. And again, many mystics kind of like referring to that as well. And Maslow in his later years of this work called it self-transcendence, and kind of like said it's the pinnacle of the human need. And he defined it as, he said it's about identifying with something beyond the individual self and experiencing unity with the whole of existence. And many other traditions also really hit on that aspect of the experiential identification with the beyond, with source, with whatever kind of like name you want to give it. It goes by many different names. And the third definition I would like to propose is spirituality as lived wisdom and embodiment. So basically spirituality not just being about leaving the world behind and transcending, but also about being fully and genuinely embracing our human life, cultivating clarity, presence, compassion, virtue, and wisdom. William James said spirituality is a process of personal transformation, either in accordance with traditional religious ideals or more genuinely toward the deepest values and meanings by which people live. And I personally like my own personal definition of spirituality is simply the pursuit of truth. And I do equal truth with many other words, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation. And there's one more really important definition of spirituality, which I'm not going to present now, but at the end of the presentation, so good to pay attention. Next up, we're going to be talking about spiritual practice, right? Based on these definitions, basically. And again, there's heaps of definitions about spiritual practice, but like a pattern, a possible pattern that we could observe is basically spiritual practice as a structured and intentional engagement with activities that are aimed at fulfilling the purpose of spirituality. Maybe as we've kind of like defined it here in these different areas. And then spiritual practices, there are an infinite amount, just as there are definitions like spirituality, meditation, contemplation, self-inquiry, prayer, just like a couple of most common ones or most popular ones. And then the next question in our inquiry basically becomes, can psychedelics be a spiritual practice? So just to gauge you, like who here thinks, yes, psychedelics can be a spiritual practice? All right. Who here thinks, no, spirituality cannot be a spiritual practice? And who here thinks, it's not that black and white, it's not that simple? Nice. Okay, so we can end the talk. I don't need to convince you anymore. Beautiful. Still, I want to go into 3 different ways in which we could see spirituality as a spiritual practice. And lots of things are very deeply interconnected and very important for this discussion around psychedelics as a spiritual practice, which we don't have the time to go into, but just for my peace of mind, I'll just have to display them on the slide here. Beautiful. So the first one I would like to propose is psychedelics as insight catalysts. So basically they're also known as tools, catalysts, mirrors, technology, or non-specific awareness amplifiers, or amplifiers of the mind, which is pointing to this kind of like field. And it seems to be a common phenomenon that psychedelics catalyze profound insights about all kinds of things, the nature of reality, consciousness, the self, and whatever else, personal topics as well. And the psychedelic experience itself, approached with intentionality and consciousness, can facilitate our direct inquiry into truth. And it opens up perspective. How it does that? It's not my area of expertise, but we have beautiful kind of like studies that have been kind of like, showing that one possible way they could do that is that the default mode network suppression leads to cognitive flexibility, reduced ego rigidity, and increased perspective taking. And that is what the psychedelics allow us to access through a direct experience of a clearly different state of consciousness, right? And as Stanislav Grof, one of the core founders of transpersonal psychology, pioneer of psychedelic therapy, has said, a single deep direct experience of expanded consciousness can provide more understanding of reality than years of intellectual study. Right? That's real insight. And in this state, it's easy to see through concepts, see through our conditioning, and kind of like question our beliefs or our reality frameworks. And taken to its extreme, anything you believe is true, you may discover is false. Anything you believe you are, you may discover you are not. As Christopher Beige, author of LSD and the Mind of the Universe, has so beautifully articulated. I love his work. I highly recommend this book. And common insights that people are experiencing is, for example, I am not the body. I am not the thought. Kind of like shifting from identifying with the body or with the mind to identifying with awareness. Or I am deeply loved, I am whole, everything is connected, life is beautiful, life is a gift. Maybe a little nuance that I want to bring in here is also based on some observations. They seem to facilitate the catalyzation of insight not through adding something new, but many people report it's a process of remembering something which they already knew inside. So I found that was kind of interesting. So psychedelics seem to have the clear potential to facilitate and catalyze insight, which might lead to a direct experiential understanding of reality and the self. And I would say that's a powerful spiritual practice in and of itself. And such an insight, related to the nature of reality or the self, can also lead to what is known as a mystical peak experience. Which brings me to the second point. Psychedelics as a potential mystical peak experience. They're also known as entheogens, generating the divine within, sacraments, pharmacotheon, and so on. It's kind of like pointing to this potential. To lay some foundations for like, okay, what do we mean by potential mystical peak experience? We have the mystical experience questionnaire, which has been used in some studies, which shows and points us to some characteristics like unity, sacredness, noetic quality, transcendence of time and space, and ineffability. Maybe not, let's not forget the love. I like to add love in there. And many spiritual traditions point to this union with the absolute as the absolute pinnacle of spirituality. So the word yoga, for example, itself means union, literally. And we have some beautiful data showing like psychedelics' potential to induce or facilitate or open us up to such an experience. And a nuance, very crucial point is here kind of like the importance of set and setting, and also the nuance of the dose and the substance seem to be playing intense, crucial roles in the facilitation of a mystical peak experience, as we define it kind of like based on the questionnaire. For example, in medium dose psilocybin sessions study from Griffith, 53% of people reported a mystical peak experience, but in a very specific set and setting, in a kind of like a spiritual group with synthetic 5-MeO DMT, over 83% of people reported a mystical peak experience. Well, 5-MeO is also known for this, but it shows kind of like the nuances of this, and but also the potential. And just to kind of like clarify the significance of these numbers, Maslow in the later, like in his works, he basically believed that only a tiny fraction of the population, perhaps 0.005%, he called it the 5% of the 5% of the 5%, ever reached what he called an absolute peak experience. He was making a distinction between relative and absolute as well. But now we seem to have a technology or a substance that seems to have a potential in the right set and setting to induce like a 50 to 80% chance of facilitating or open us up to such an experience. And I think that's quite insane, like that's powerful. And we see the benefits beyond even the temporary peak experience that people basically report not just increases or like benefits for mental health, but overall improved well-being and life satisfaction. Because it's quite an experience, right? In the Griffith study, 1/3 of participants rated it the most meaningful experience of their lives. And a true mystical kind of like peak experience can reorient a person's entire life toward the priorities of spiritual connection. Like classic example is Ram Dass, or many kind of like Western spiritual teachers or Buddhist practitioners have found their origin of interest in spirituality in a mystical peak experience induced by psychedelics. But still, it's a temporary experience, and as Chris Bays is beautifully like posing this question, what is the value of true but temporary knowledge? And I guess that's a question that everyone has to kind of like answer for themselves. I can't answer that for you, but for me personally, even though sometimes I might feel saddened to lose this state of grace, there is a deep appreciation in me that I have been blessed enough to experience it. And for me personally, it seems to be better than to experience it and to return to the pain of separation than to have never entered in the first place, because that would be an unthinkable loss for me. And so even though it's not shifting our consciousness to kind of like a permanent perception of the unitary field of consciousness, it gives us, or has the potential to give us a glimpse of the absolute. And I would say that's a valid and transformative spiritual experience. And also it's not easy and it's not guaranteed, right? It depends on setting, maybe the priming and the preparation and our ability to surrender as well. Many people call it a moment of grace. But it's not all about the peak states, right? As spiritual teacher Alma said, we sometimes view our path as including two major journeys, ascent and descent. A journey toward enlightenment and the journey toward becoming a complete human being. Which brings me to the last point. Psychedelics as character cultivators, the practice of embodied wisdom. Because they're also known as allies, friends, teachers, or masters. pointing to their potential for this. And beyond the peak experience, psychedelic practice can lead to lasting changes in personality, perception, and character, deepening core spiritual traits. And we might have a nudge that the spiritual life is not about altered states, but altered traits, not about states of consciousness, but stages of development. Right? Or some also might refer to these as the embodiment of noble virtues. And many spiritual traditions have their own kind of lists of these. And for simplification, we'll just go into a couple that I picked here. One being courage and responsibility. Right? Before a journey, it takes courage to even face that mystical peak experience, to face that unknown, to step into this experience of the psychedelic. And it takes commitment, dedication, a willingness to face truth, building resilience by embracing resistance. And we have kind of like studies showing that the reduced amygdala reactivity to fear-based stimuli post-psychedelic experience might lead to less avoidance and more confrontation of inner challenges after the experience. I would say that's embodied wisdom, that's courage basically. And Joseph Campbell, author of The Hero's Journey, said, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." But I would say the courage, the very act of courage to look at that fear, to enter that cave, is often what heals us. It's what builds character. Right? Courage is a muscle, and the psychedelics give us an opportunity to be training that muscle, and they can act as a training ground for building us courage. And then in the experience, oftentimes, we have this notion of surrendering and letting go. Right? Key lesson many people report back is that resistance in psychedelic space leads to lots of suffering and problems. Typical mantra is to just trust and let go. Obviously there's nuance to this, but basically, yeah, training acceptance, embracing, realization. And many people, when I talk about surrender, many people come to me and they're like, what is surrender? Like, I don't even know what it means to me. I don't know how to do it. And the psychedelics give us a reference point, because in the experience it gets very real, and it provides an opportunity to understand what it really means to surrender and let go. And then we can take that, again, into our daily life afterwards as embodied wisdom. And then we have humility and open-mindedness. Because one thing is for sure, like if you engage with psychedelics as a serious practice, I can promise you that you will be humbled. Especially also in the higher doses, you will be humbled. You can expect to be surprised, right? Because that's one of their characteristics. It's to shatter certainty. It's to show us how little we know. It's to show us the wisdom of not knowing as well. Right? It's this experience of the mystery, typically reported as a sense of awe and wonder. And it reminds us of what some people might call the importance to cultivate beginner's mind, or a certain kind of like adaptability and flexibility in our perception of the world. And that again, in and of itself, is a beautiful trait, much appreciated in many traditions and teachings. And from this emptiness of self, from this place of humility, oftentimes there's a compassion and connection arising, and increased love, empathy, and appreciation for self and others. The sense of connection might also lead to forgiveness, gratitude, or a sense of lightheartedness. And studies show that psilocybin increases emotional empathy, pro-social behavior, and self-compassion after the experience. Personal kind of like anecdote is the Ho'oponopono prayer. It's a traditional Hawaiian prayer which really resonates with me. It goes like this. It says, "I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you." And psychedelics really have given me the opportunity to really grasp the profundity and significance of this prayer and to live it in my life a little bit more. And from this what this results to is maybe acts of kindness, acts of generosity, service, and relational depth, which are part of a virtuous life, or we could say a spiritual life. And just as an honorable mention, not a trait, but let's not forget the importance of the body as well. When we talk about embodiment, the body is very important in our life. And I would say psychedelic practice itself even brings attention to the body, because psychedelic practice requires us to have a healthy, grounded connection to the body. Right? Like an athlete preparing for a marathon, sometimes in deep psychedelic space, we're going to be training our body to be able to process these intense energies that we could experience. And to summarize this, I have a clip which is not showing up here, but that's fine. Maybe you can hear it, maybe you can just read it. It's not that important. No, okay. Basically, it was from Evans Almighty. Basically, God saying, what do you think? Like, if someone prays for courage, does God give them courage, or does God give them the opportunity to be courageous? Someone prays for patience, does God give them patience, or does God give them the opportunity to be patient? And if someone wants their family to be closer, you think God gives them warm, fuzzy feelings, or the opportunity to love each other? That's basically what he was saying. That's beautiful. And it points to kind of like the conclusion of this chapter, that an engagement with serious psychedelic practice on a regular basis, like a regular practice and engagement over and over again, brings us face to face with our humanness and seems to open up the opportunity, not the necessity, to cultivate these noble virtues or these character traits, which is highlighting spirituality as embodied wisdom. And again, infinite number of more ways in which psychedelics could be seen as a spiritual practice, which are again very important and I would love to discuss, but we don't have the time to go into those. Because we're going to be talking about pitfalls and integration, because there are an infinite number of pitfalls, challenges, traps, dangers, and nuances on the path of pursuing spirituality alone. And when you throw psychedelics into the mix, it makes it even more messy and complicated. So we'll just go into three key ones. Number one, the pitfall of self-deception and certainty. So even though psychedelics can lead to profound insight, they can also open up the door to dogmatic beliefs and grandiosity, believing that you have the truth, epistemic arrogance, feeling superior because you've had some psychedelic insights, overconfidence and misinterpretation, or a projection of meaning, assigning deep significance to something without discernment or proper contextualization. Right? Second one is the pitfall of spiritual emergency, psychological overload, and existential crisis. Because for some people, this experience might be too radical to accept. Right? Some might just not be ready for such a radical shift in consciousness and experience existential collapse or deep spiritual confusion. A couple examples are also people reporting depersonalization and derealization. The common kind of like solipsism crisis, realizing your oneness with all, but then losing all meaning or motivation in daily life. And many more. Jules Evans has done fantastic work in the field of extended difficulties following the use of psychedelic substances. Highly recommend checking out his work. And I personally have been blessed to experience what Stanislav Grof called a spiritual emergency, or a dark night of the soul, or however you want to call it, Kundalini energy awakening. And let me tell you, it's all fun and games until somebody loses an eye. It's not like it has, after some like profound 5-MeO DMT experience, I found myself in a 3-month kind of like period of expanded state of consciousness with intense fear, terror, panic, leading to a period where I was not able to function in daily life anymore. And I still have very loud ringing in the ears, a tinnitus, reminding me of the power of these tools that we are playing with here. And the last pitfall is the pitfall of ego backlash and ego inflation and psychedelic or spiritual bypassing. Right? What I mean by ego backlash is basically feeling disillusioned or discouraged when progress isn't instant after you come down from the peak experience. And after disintegration, the ego can also integrate back even stronger and reinforce its mechanisms even stronger. And the mind resists change after the experience, judging the pace of one's own natural unfolding. Or worse, even an attachment to peak experiences might conclude out of this, judging psychedelic states of consciousness as superior or better than ordinary ones. And the potential of ego inflation is basically some kind of like a building of a spiritual ego. I take psychedelics so I'm more spiritual, I'm more enlightened than you are. Right? Or psychedelic and spiritual bypassing, coined by John Wellwood, the spiritual bypassing, basically meaning using spirituality or psychedelics as an escape, as a crutch, thinking that they're going to solve all your problems and then avoiding the real personal work that you're doing. But what's the difference between those people who fall into these traps and people who grow? I would say it's part of it is the science and art of integration, right? And a big part of integration is avoiding these traps and pitfalls and these dangers. And when we ask ourselves that question, what is psychedelic integration? I find it's a similarly funny one as what is spirituality? It's that I came to a similar conclusion that psychedelic integration is not limited in any way or to anything. Basically, I always like to say psychedelic integration is life itself. It's not separate. And when we take psychedelics into our life as a practice, as a regular engagement, there's also a dissolution of the boundary between preparation and integration. It becomes one kind of like unified process in your life, in every day of your life. And so when I walk with clients, I just have to approach it from a holistic framework, and we're looking at the physical, mental, emotional, social, environmental, and spiritual aspects of one's being, because all of those are crucial to be living a good life. And again, much more nuance here, much more depth, much more categories we can go into, but just to know that psychedelic integration is a crucial part of psychedelics as a spiritual practice. And also part of integration is paradox, which I'm not going to go into now, but Chris Besch again described it beautifully. As he said, we could see the psychedelic experience as an ecstatic experience of the perfection of being in the midst of ever incomplete becoming. I think that's quite beautiful. So, to conclude, can psychedelics be a spiritual practice? I would say yes, and a big but with nuance. They can reveal deep insights, facilitate mystical experiences, and cultivate character, but they are not magic pills. The real spiritual path is in our own sincerity to deconstruct and understand, in our dedication to the one, and in the way we live as an embodied human on a moment-to-moment basis. But before I wrap up, I promised you there's one more thing, a final perspective that challenges everything we've talked about so far. And I promise you another very important definition of spirituality. Because maybe spirituality is not about gaining insights. Maybe spirituality is not about reaching a mystical peak experience or even personal transformation. What if the deepest spiritual realization is that there's nothing to seek, nowhere to go, and nothing to attain? I really took Bodhidharma's advice into heart, into some psychedelic sessions, as he said, don't hold on to any appearance whatsoever, you will succeed. Right? Basically detaching from all appearances. But my own experience took me a step further, and I had kind of like the feeling that my greatest service seems to be appreciating all appearances, to honor them, to love them unconditionally. And so the dance of detached appreciation became kind of like my highest ideal, my spiritual practice in daily life and in psychedelic space. And from that standpoint then, the psychedelic experience is not a means to an end anymore, but an end in and of itself, just as true meditation shall be. Thank you very much. Here's some ways to stay connected if this resonates. Hit me up, let's be connected, and open for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philip. That was so engaging and so interesting, interesting perspective that we have had from the morning, and it's so great to hear from you and everything you say. So yeah, opening up the floor to questions, if anyone has anything to ask.
You mentioned you're an integration coach. How do you help your clients integrate challenging experiences?
Yeah, good question. Basically, again, kind of like I let the client lead the sessions, so looking at what they're struggling with, exploring what's the real issue, and then kind of like finding ways or facilitating them to find ways that and steps that they could take to then help themselves. Oftentimes it's related to this, like, okay, like, do you take care of your body? How do you take care of your emotional well-being? Are you reading? Are you intellectually engaging? And are you in nature, right? All of these basic things are basically what it's coming down to lots of the times.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Are there any, what do you think would be the best thing for within the clinical environment to foster such experiences? If you can you think of any like practical examples of what could be implemented, you know, with the way we're using psychedelics in clinical settings that could maybe evoke these experiences or lend a hand to the integration of these experiences?
Yeah, I don't know how it works in the clinical setting, like that's not my area of expertise, but I could imagine more like a proper education beforehand, like educating the participants about the potential of the psychedelics. And like I find that preparation is basically one of the biggest parts of this work. to then be able to engage with the experience intentionally and properly, to then get the most out of it as well. And yeah, regarding the setting in the clinical, I don't know, probably move more towards nature. I mean, there's some movement happening there, and to make it a bit more nice. And integration support, also not leaving people right after the experience, but letting them. And also we have the like kind of like logistical difficulties of people wanting to return to the experience but not being able to. So that's a huge area of improvement, I would say, to be able to open up the doors. Difficult with the logistics and facilities, right? To say people can come back, because one experience is likely not going to be this like full transformation that's needed for deep trauma and kind of mental health issues.
Yeah.
You mentioned you had a spiritual emergency situation in your life. So can you share your experience of how you overcome it, and what practices you did, and
if you go to my website, actually the picture, it was a book I wrote that was born out of my spiritual emergency. You were asking how I overcame it, or also the nature of the experience?
No, how you overcome it.
How I overcome it? Education. Again, I was kind of like, I was in a state of looking for anything that will help me, and so I was looking for anything. So I was studying like graphs, spiritual emergency, reading lots of John Cross, St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul, really getting like a reference point that I'm not alone in this experience, because it definitely feels like you're all alone, like nobody can understand what you're going through, but there's kind of finding reference points for people who are experiencing something similar. And then practices, trying out practices really helped me. I really found some comfort in Sikhism, chanting the Siri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, the Mool Mantra specifically, and singing, chanting, trusting, really allowing myself to take a break from life, really. And I cycled through different things. I don't know what specifically helped. I just tried everything: acupuncture, Chinese medicine, like going out, doing spiritual practice. Okay, leaving spirituality behind altogether and just distracting myself. So, just not giving up, trusting, being grateful for the experience, connecting with people. I went out a lot, and like all my friends basically came from this period because I was just so desperate to not be alone in this state, but to just connect with people and let them, like, allow myself to be helped.
Thank you.
I think you mentioned the core of your endeavour was the truth, or to seek truth, or to become. But no matter what, I think you mightn't like it, and maybe that was your spiritual crisis. What I'm saying is that implies, is that a truth in a perennial sense for everyone, that everyone, you believe everyone collectively, there is one truth that can be realized, or is it, or maybe it's one of these paradoxes?
It's one of these paradoxes, I guess, for sure. Like, I don't know what truth is. But that quest for truth, it requires, I would say, lots of sacrifice that people are not ready to endeavor. Like, because it requires basically everything. There's another quote from Chris Page that resonated beautifully. He said, basically, the price of everything is that you're going to be giving up everything, or giving up everything is the price of inheriting everything else. So, I don't know.
Well, I think the other thing I was saying about, but a lot of the peak transcendent psychedelic experience goes beyond good and evil, but yet we're kind of implying here that we're really looking for all the good, the love, the oneness.
In my personal understanding of truth, I equal it with infinite goodness. So in my perception of reality, everything is infinitely good. At least that's the ideal perspective that I want to take on. Obviously, I can't embody it on a day-to-day basis, and kind of like my dualistic, realistic, relatively kind of like embodied presence, but that's kind of like, from my understanding, what I would aim for, the complete dissolution of good and bad. And still recognizing, that's the paradox, that good and bad is a very crucial distinction to be moving to a illusionary better future of our society. So holding this tension between those two.
I was wondering, sort of based on what you were saying about people coming out of spiritual crisis, how much do you work with a person in sort of mytho-poetic, archetypal realms and these stories that seem to play out time and time again through different civilizations that kind of seem to give us the same meanings, the same messages, if you see where I'm coming from?
You have an example of one of these archetypal messages?
So something I'm working with at the moment is the Divine Comedy, Dante's Divine Comedy, and that journey through Hades, purgatory, and all sorts of biblical stories through things that you find in Bhagavad Gita. These stories that they play out time and time again in different, almost like they seemingly unconnected places, but they seem to be part of, to lean on the Jungian style of things. It's that archetypal imagery, collective stories that are embedded in the collective consciousness.
Yeah. What's the question?
I'm just wondering how much has that been part of your process?
It hasn't at all. Like, I love to explore all of these, and I deeply appreciate them, and it's just like a very deep personal curiosity. And but in my personal experiences, they haven't been played out that much. Like my psychedelic experiences are very empty of content lots of the times. At least in the archetypal kind of like realms, it's very interesting. But I love to study them and draw the difference, like the similarities, and like tap into what these people might have been experiencing, as there seem to be these like broader patterns that are playing out in the cosmos. Yeah, for sure.
That's it. I think we break for lunch. Thank you again so much.